The desert always came alive at 05:15, not with noise, but with color. The first streaks of dawn spread across the Nevada sky, soft pinks bleeding into copper before the heat turned it all white. Echo 9. A long strip of sand and concrete tucked miles away from the main base at Nellis, sat perfectly still under that early light. It looked empty, but she was already there. Nora Quinn pulled her truck up to the northern service gate, the same as she had every morning for the last 3 years. She drove an old Ford with faded green paint and a single crack across the passenger side window. At the gate, the airman on duty gave her a short nod without looking away from his clipboard. She responded with nothing more than a brief glance. No words. There never were. By 05:28, she had parked at the east shed, unlocked the range controls, and logged her presence into the range logbook. Her handwriting was narrow and even. She moved through the checklist with a routine that bordered on ritual. Power grid check. Environmental sensors recalibrated. Hydraulic target rails tested for drift. She wore a plain ball cap and noise-dampening headset even when she wasn't near shooters. It was habit more than protection. The first half hour was her favorite. The sand hadn't been disturbed yet. No engines. No boot prints. Just a field of steel silhouettes. Some scored with bullet marks. Others pristine. All waiting. She walked the line alone, inspecting target plates with a keen eye. A sliver of a weld had fractured on target 3A's base. She bent, pulled out her multi-tool, and filed it down. A mistake like that would skew ricochet readings and mess with ballistic calculations. No one would have noticed. She always did. Inside the control shed, she made a final check on the input terminals. The newer ballistic software ran slow on the older machines, so she manually corrected 2 input lags. She didn't say a word while working, even though she knew no one was listening. The screens flickered once, then held steady. She exhaled and adjusted her cap. At 06:05, a convoy of Humvees rolled into the far side of the range. SEAL candidates. Most didn't glance her way. To them, she was just part of the background, the girl in the shed, the one who calibrated their steel. She wasn't offended. In fact, she preferred it that way. Her uniform was a standard civilian contractor set, olive shirt, khaki pants, and worn boots that fit her perfectly. Her ID badge dangled from her hip, clipped just behind her holster. The Glock 17 she carried was standard issue, but barely touched. She never spoke unless necessary. Even then, only if there was a problem no one else could solve. And when that happened, she solved it quietly. By 07:10, a light breeze kicked up. It would start to affect the long-range lanes by midday. She adjusted the wind sensors manually, knowing the digital readouts often lagged by as much as half a second. The difference between a hit and a miss at 1,800 meters was rarely dramatic. It was usually one click, a fraction of breath, or a delay in the neural loop. She made sure none of those were due to the system. As the day warmed, voices echoed downrange. Laughter, cursing, commands. Some of it carried into her workspace, but she filtered it out. She had tuned her ears to machinery and gunfire. People were harder to calibrate. They had moods, opinions, egos. Nora dealt in measurable outcomes. Metal, math, motion. She passed Captain Ward once that morning. He was focused on the trainees, clipboard in hand. He gave her a passing nod, maybe a second longer than usual. She nodded back. It was the most interaction she'd had with anyone that week. The rest of the morning flowed with clockwork precision. Target alignment held. Wind stayed under 7 knots. One of the impact sensors on lane 6 reported latency. She fixed it with a hard reboot and realignment of the wiring conduit. No one noticed. She preferred it that way. By noon, she'd vanished back into the shed. Same as always. Range Echo 9 operated smoothly, accurately, and without interruption. Just how she liked it. She was everywhere and nowhere. She kept the entire system running, but to most eyes, she didn't exist. And that was exactly how Nora Quinn wanted it. At 07:45, the first convoy kicked up dust near the perimeter fence. 3 Humvees followed by 2 LMTVs rolled into Echo 9's Southern Access Road, each carrying a mix of Navy SEALs and Air Force para-rescue men scheduled for long-range engagement drills. The noise rolled in with them, doors slamming, voices rising, the sharp clack of gear being unloaded and slung over shoulders. The range, once silent, came alive with boots and brass. Nora stood near the control shed, finishing calibration on a set of targets for Lane B. The clipboard in her hand was smudged with graphite, each box checked twice. She glanced up just long enough to see Captain Eli Ward approach the firing line. He was broad-shouldered, clean-cut, and exact in both tone and posture. His voice carried with the kind of calm that made people straighten up without thinking. Warrant Officer Seth Anders stepped out of the second Humvee, a well-worn suppressor poking out of his sling bag and a look of absolute certainty stamped on his face. He scanned the range like he owned it. There was something permanent about his smirk, like it had survived dozens of firefights and only grown sharper. Trailing behind was Lieutenant Jason Maddox, younger, quieter, more deliberate. His eyes didn't roam like the others. They locked onto what mattered: spacing, elevation, wind direction. He nodded to the team and broke off toward the equipment station without saying much. That was the first time he noticed Nora moving along the control line, her steps light but sure, eyes tracking every mechanism. By 08, 20 drills had begun. Pairs rotated through firing lanes, calling wind values and zeroing optics. The range echoed with the crisp bark of suppressed rifles. Anomalies showed up on target 4C. Nora saw it before the system flagged it. The target had a slight drift left, just under 2 MOA. She walked calmly to the terminal, recalibrated the sensors, and logged the correction without a word. Then it happened. Seth missed a third consecutive shot at 1,400 meters and cursed under his breath. He turned to the fire control station and waved a hand sharply in frustration. His voice was louder than necessary. "This system's off, and there's no way I'm pulling left. Target drift or the tech's asleep." No one answered. Nora was already approaching, toolbox in hand. She knelt beside the rear panel of the unit and began inspecting the input channel, her body half in shadow. She didn't look at Seth. She didn't say a word. He shook his head, scoffing. "She's the one who maintains this place. Right figures." The others chuckled, not quite knowing where to look. She ignored them. Her fingers moved quickly, resetting a loose cable and adjusting the signal sync on the internal diagnostic panel. It was a 2-minute fix. She stood, nodded to Captain Ward, and started to walk away. Seth raised his voice again. I guess no apology for screwing up our lanes, thought Not. Still, nothing from her. But Jason watched it all, arms folded. He'd noticed something when she knelt, her posture, the way she adjusted elevation like she'd done it 1,000 times. And the fix she made wasn't just fast. It was specific, accurate to the decimal. He'd seen range techs fumble for tools and double-check manuals. She hadn't needed either. Back at the control shed, Nora logged the update and returned to the calibration bay. The laughter had faded, replaced by focus and murmurs. Someone mentioned her again, but she didn't react. Jason watched her as she adjusted the wind flags, turning each post by hand, setting tension perfectly to match the early morning gusts. It wasn't procedure. It was instinct. At 09:05, Captain Ward stopped briefly by her workstation, everything running smooth. She nodded, barely lifting her gaze. He moved on without asking more. That was their rhythm. It worked. By late morning, the sun baked the sand and paint off the steel plates. Nora stayed in the background, invisible again. But now, one set of eyes followed her with growing interest. Jason had started to see what the rest missed. Her silence wasn't incompetence, it was discipline. Not hiding, containing. And somehow, That felt heavier than anything they'd carried in. By 1340, the heat shimmer off the sand blurred the far targets like ghosts. The steel silhouette at 2,100 meters wavered behind rolling mirage, barely visible through high-powered optics. The wind had shifted again, now gusting southeast at 12 knots, variable every few seconds. No one had scored a clean hit all day. Shooters adjusted their dope, took careful aim, fired, and cursed when the rounds either clipped the edge or missed entirely. Seth Anders stepped away from his spot at lane 3, annoyance boiling off him. He slapped the bolt on his rifle and shook his head. With a dry laugh, he motioned toward a nearby airman who had just missed another shot. "You're flinching. Maybe we should let the target girl take a crack at it. Probably hit better than half of you." A few chuckles scattered through the line. Nora stood 30 feet back, kneeling near a diagnostic case. Her back turned. She didn't look up. Jason Maddox did. He didn't smile. Instead, he walked toward the bench behind his lane, where a matte black case rested in the shade of the canopy. Inside was his personal weapon, an Accuracy International AXMC chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. The optic was a Schmidt & Bender PMII, zeroed for the week's drills. The bipod legs clicked as he extended them. He checked the bolt, slid in a fresh 5-round magazine, and held the rifle out. He didn't speak, just offered it toward Nora like a question. She stood slowly. The range fell quiet. She took the rifle with both hands, movements smooth and practiced, not cautious, familiar. She walked past the shooters, past Anders, and lay prone on the concrete pad of lane 1. No one moved. Her elbows settled first, forming a tight triangle. She adjusted the bipod legs by a single notch, then rolled her shoulder into the stock. Her cheek rested against the comb without tension. She dialed the scope once. Not a guess. She knew the hold. She slid the bolt, chambered around, and breathed. The wind kicked across her right shoulder. She read the mirage, felt the crosswind in her skin. Her left hand gripped the rear of the rifle. She didn't blink. No range card, no calculator, no spotter. Just her. She exhaled halfway, paused, squeezed. The shot cracked out like a whip. Everyone leaned forward. A full 3 seconds passed. The impact marker flipped, center hit. Someone near the back whispered, "That's not possible." She didn't smile. She slid the bolt, chambered the next round, and adjusted 0.5 mil left. Another breath. Another pause. Second shot, same target. Impact flag rose again. No one laughed. No one clapped. They just stared. She stood, handed the rifle back to Maddox, and walked toward the shed, without a word. The only sound was the breeze and the faint metallic ping echoing across the sand. The second impact flag rose just as slow as the first. Clean, center, no wind drift, no luck. A full 5 seconds passed before anyone breathed. Nora stayed prone for another moment, her eye still behind the scope. Not because she needed to, because she wasn't ready to break the silence first. When she finally stood, she moved with the same calm that had carried her to the firing line. No swagger, no glance back. She set the rifle in Maddox's hands and walked away. Captain Ward lowered his binoculars and stared at the distant steel plate. He'd been in command too long to believe in coincidences. His mind clicked through names, places, after-action reports. A shot like that twice, on command, narrowed the list to almost nothing. There weren't many who had ever pulled it off, and only one name came up attached to a record that hadn't been matched in over a decade. His eyes followed her path to the shed. Seth Anders hadn't moved. He was still standing halfway down the line, rifle slung, jaw tight. The color in his face had drained. He opened his mouth like he might say something, then closed it. He turned away and adjusted his scope even though he wasn't about to fire again. Jason Maddox didn't follow her. He just watched the spot where she'd been prone, the empty mat, the slight impression where her elbows had braced, the scent of oil still fresh on the AXMC. He didn't need the name. He already knew. A few of the junior operators exchanged glances, unsure what they had just witnessed. No one reached for their weapons. No one reset their stance. They just stood there in the shifting wind, listening to the flags rattle. At 13:49, Nora disappeared into the side bay of the range. Same as always. But the atmosphere hadn't reset with her absence. Something had cracked. The air felt different, tighter, like a secret had been accidentally exposed and now no one knew how to treat it. Captain Ward spoke quietly to his range sergeant, his voice low but clipped. There was movement on the far end of the comms tent, someone pulling up a record tablet, typing fast. Quiet conversations started forming in corners, voices hushed like they were speaking in a chapel. They all knew her name now, or at least suspected. But it wasn't the name that changed the air around Echo 9. It was the shot, or maybe what followed the absence of any celebration. No pride, no acknowledgement. Just 2 clean hits, and a woman walking away like it meant nothing. At 18:15, the sun was slipping behind the western ridge, casting long shadows over Echo 9. Most of the teams had packed up. A few stayed to clean weapons or log gear, but the range was mostly quiet now. Captain Eli Ward stood near the admin building, hands in his pockets, eyes watching the shed. He hadn't asked her to report. He'd simply waited. Nora eventually stepped out, walked without urgency, and stopped a few feet from him. He nodded toward the building. She followed. Inside, the command room was dim and still, humming with low fan noise. A file sat open on the desk. The name on the front tab was hers. It had been pulled from deep archives restricted clearance, eyes-only type. He didn't push it toward her, just let it sit there. Paper, corners, curling, from years, untouched. She stood near the window. He spoke softly. Force Recon. 1st Marine Division. Transferred to JSOC in 2010. Certified sniper. Long-range reconnaissance. Afghanistan deployment. 2011 through late 2013. 1 confirmed record at 2,300 meters. Kandahar province. 5 targets. 1 engagement. She said nothing. He waited a beat, then continued. That file stayed sealed under direct order. No discharge hearing. No media. Just separation. Her voice came quiet, so soft he leaned in without meaning to. I didn't want the medal. I didn't want the record. I wanted to forget the shot. He didn't interrupt. She looked down at her hands. They were still stained faint with oil from calibrating the lanes. Same hands that had pulled the trigger that day. It was a village perimeter. Locals called it the Red Crescent, shaped around an old canal. Intel said insurgents were arming teenagers, maybe even younger. They weren't bluffing. The boys were carrying Type 56. One had a vest. No flags. No warning. They came through the poppy fields, clustered. My spotter called it. I confirmed. We asked for ROE authorization. It came 5 seconds later. She paused. Her throat caught. I hit 4 in 4 seconds. The 5th turned, started to run. He was maybe 13. I still see the way his shirt caught the wind. Ward didn't move. Not out of discipline, but because he couldn't. She kept speaking, barely above a whisper. They framed it as a strategic kill, said it saved 20 Marines downrange. Maybe it did. Doesn't matter. I felt the wind pattern. I saw the arc. I made that choice. That shot didn't just end a life. It cracked something in me. I couldn't aim again after that, without hearing the silence that came after. She reached for the back of a chair, not to sit, just to steady herself. I didn't resign because I was weak. I resigned because I knew I couldn't trust myself to be right again. That's a sniper's worst sin. Doubt. Ward's voice finally broke the stillness. You could have done anything. You chose this range tech at Echo 9. She nodded once. Steel doesn't bleed, and it doesn't beg. He exhaled slowly, leaned forward on the desk, fingers brushing the edge of her file. They buried that mission under 7 layers of clearance. Everyone forgot. Except you. Her eyes didn't blink. It's not something you forget. It becomes something you carry. The air in the room thickened. Not heavy with rank or orders, just memory. He closed the file without a sound. You could help them. You could train them. Teach them how to avoid being in your position. She didn't answer. Not yet. But her hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in a long while. At 1848 she left the room, alone. The sky was deep blue now, scattered stars just beginning to surface. Behind her, the building sat silent, like it understood. At 07:10 the next morning, Captain Ward met Nora outside the control shed. He didn't issue an order. He just asked, said the trainees needed something more than drills and data. Something real. She gave a polite shake of the head and returned to her checklist. Ward didn't press. By E8:45 she was alone at Lane 7 adjusting wind flags again. The air was colder than usual. Gusts came in short bursts, but carried inconsistent speeds across altitude bands. She was logging shifts when Jason approached with 3 younger shooters trailing behind. He said nothing at first. Just stood nearby, watching her hands trace patterns in the air like she could read wind the way others read words. Then, one of the trainees, a tall kid from Fort Benning, asked why his 0 was consistent at 600 meters but scattered at 900. She turned slightly, looked at him, then at the sky, told him he was measuring surface wind but ignoring layered drift, that the wind didn't blow flat, it stacked. They stared like it was a foreign language. She walked over to a portable whiteboard set against a support truck, picked up a marker, drew 3 horizontal lines stacked top to bottom, wrote values, 3, 7, 10 knots. Then she marked altitude ranges, explained how bullet drop over distance had to pass through each layer and that the angle of influence varied with barrel pitch and heat shimmer. The math wasn't in their manuals, but it was precise. She called it layered wind formula, said it saved more lives than scopes ever did. Jason asked her how she calculated hold without relying on tech. She said she didn't. She calculated rhythm. She pointed to the flag snaps, said the difference between a good sniper and a lucky one was knowing which gusts lied and which ones whispered the truth. They listened in silence. She guided them back to Lane 3, told them to shoot at 900, but not until they could predict the wind speed within 2 knots by eye. The first trainee missed twice, then dialed down. Third shot clipped the plate. He grinned. She didn't. She just adjusted the wind flag again and said try it again with crosswind pressure. By 10:05 every one of them had improved. Not perfectly, but clearly. No one called her ma'am. No one called her ghost. They just watched her like she was the part of the range they hadn't understood yet. And she finally, quietly, stayed a few minutes longer than she needed to. At 13:20, the heat over Echo 9 had settled into a thick haze. The far targets beyond 2,000 meters blurred in the mirage, their outlines swimming just above the sand. One of the younger trainees, a corporal from North Carolina, stepped up to Lane 2 with determination written all over him. He wanted a shot at 2,500 meters. No one had asked him. He just needed to prove something. He had the rifle ready and optics adjusted, but his stance showed nerves. Seth Anders leaned on the spotting scope behind him, arms crossed, voice sharp. He made a comment loud enough for everyone to hear, said the kid was trying too hard to impress ghosts. Said he'd be better off sticking to 800 meters until his spine grew in. A few heads turned. The trainee froze for a second. He didn't argue, just looked down at his hands on the bolt. That was when Nora stepped forward. She didn't walk fast, but her steps drew attention. For the first time, she didn't skirt the edge of the group. She walked through it, past Maddox, past the other instructors, straight to the bench behind the corporal. She asked one question. Had he checked the terrain roll? He blinked, confused. She knelt beside him and pointed, from muzzle to target. The ground dipped, then climbed in a subtle arc. She explained how the air pressure changed over the depression and created a lateral drag shift at the midpoint. Wind at 700 meters pushed left, but at 1800 it reversed because of contour funneling. It wasn't just wind speed, it was how the ground shaped it. He nodded, watching her hands as she traced it in the air. She told him to dial elevation for 2450, hold 1 mil high for mirage refraction, and brake on the exhale. Then she stood up, not behind him, but to his side, in full view of everyone. The shot rang out clean and loud. The delay was long. Then the marker flipped, low right edge, not center, but on plate. Respectable. Real. The corporal looked up, stunned. Seth didn't speak. Maddox smiled quietly near the rear of the crowd. Nora didn't say, "Well done." She just said, "Now, try again." But this time, adjust 1/10 left for the cross shear. He nodded and reloaded. And in that moment, surrounded by rifles and ranks, she wasn't just the ghost anymore. She was the one in the light. Not proving anything, just passing it on. At 09:00 on a Tuesday, the black Suburban returned to Echo 9. Dust followed it like a second shadow across the gravel. General Carter stepped out, pressed his cap into place, and walked toward the main structure with the kind of pace that made people move aside without being asked. Ward met him. Halfway. They spoke quietly inside the main office. A few heads turned when Nora's name came up. No rank was mentioned, no titles. Just a simple observation she was doing more for these shooters than 3 weeks of simulation. At 09:17, Ward found her by the elevation station. She was recalibrating the sensors with a torque wrench. He didn't waste time. Carter wants you back in the fold, not as a symbol, as a mind. She didn't look up, just said she'd talk. Not today, tomorrow. At 11:00 the next morning, she met them both inside the conference unit. The old planning trailer converted into a secure brief room. Carter laid out the offer. Tactical advisor, formal role, access to curriculum development, shooter evaluations, and sniper program design. He emphasized it wasn't just about credentials. They needed capability, and she had it in a language no one else spoke fluently. Nora listened without folding in. Then she spoke clearly. She would teach. She would build frameworks. She would write doctrine if needed. But she would not touch psychological profiling. No kill house drills. No recon insertion games. No role-playing war guilt. Her domain was physics and mechanics. Wind. Ballistics. Trigger math. She said it calmly. But it wasn't a negotiation. It was her one condition. Carter accepted without pushback. Ward smiled quietly. By 14:40 that same afternoon, she'd sent a rough draft of what would become Echo 9's new long-range engagement syllabus. It outlined 5 modules: terrain-informed trajectory correction, atmospheric stacking, recoil control under fatigue, live adaptive zeroing, and layered wind logic. Each phase built on variables that live fire couldn't teach unless observed by someone who understood what most missed. She titled it simply, Field Optics and Applied Precision. At 15:10, Ward signed off on the proposal. By 16:00, the base XO had posted a call for new class rosters. The first sessions were full before the sun dipped behind the ridge. That evening, Nora didn't walk back to her quarters. She stayed at the range longer than usual, checking the new plate positions and marking corrections. When a young lieutenant offered to reset one of the targets for her, she nodded, didn't deflect, didn't vanish, just nodded. No one made speeches. No one handed her a plaque or pinned on a badge, but over the next week, shooters referred to her as ma'am, not out of formality, out of clarity. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was part of the structure. Not above it, not beneath it, just placed right, balanced. Her steps felt different now, not heavier or lighter, but aligned. She had chosen the shape of her return, and it didn't echo like regret. It settled like precision. At 17:32, the last of the training squads packed up gear and cleared Echo 9's main line. Wind pushed softly down from the ridge, lazy and warm. Jason Maddox leaned against the open tailgate of his truck, sipping water, eyes on the auxiliary range. He hadn't said much all day, but when he saw Nora crossing the lot, he straightened and gave a small nod. She wore her work shirt rolled at the sleeves, a ball cap pulled low. In her hands was a battered hard case with a hand-painted compass rose near the latch. Jason offered no speech, just motioned toward the range. They walked in silence. The auxiliary line sat behind a small berm east of the admin trailer. It was rarely used, not for qualification or instruction. Just practice, no scoring, no spectators. It felt like the kind of place where the noise of the world didn't quite reach. At 17:48, Nora set the case down on the bench. She opened it slowly. Inside was a rifle no one else on base had seen her use. Custom stocked, matte finish worn thin at the cheek rest. It had the look of a tool used often, then retired quietly. She lifted it, checked the bolt, and set the bipod gently into the gravel. Jason took position beside her, unfolding a spotting mat. No range commands, no rank, just rhythm. She chambered a round with quiet precision. At 18:01, she took her first shot. The impact pinged faint at 1,400 meters, soft in the still air. Jason made no comment, only adjusted his eye behind the glass. Then he fired next. His grouping held slightly right, and she offered him a single suggestion drop, one click on elevation. Hold quarter left. They took turns. No pressure, no watchers, just the steady pace of breath and steel. The kind of pace that didn't push for resolution, only presence. Nora's hands moved with confidence, but no urgency. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. Between rounds, she sat back and looked toward the far hills. She said that for years. She thought disappearing was how you protected yourself, that if you stayed unseen, you couldn't be broken again. But all it did was slow the breaking, delay it, stretch it thin until the silence turned sharp. Then she said she finally understood something. She didn't come back because someone pulled her. She came back because she chose to. Not out of guilt, not to erase anything, but to stop being shaped only by the part of her that had survived. Jason didn't fill the silence. He just loaded another round and fired clean. At 18:27, she closed the bolt gently and smiled, just barely. Said she didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She felt like a person again. Not whole, but not hiding. They packed up without hurry. At 06:10 the next morning, Nora stepped into Echo 9's briefing room carrying 2 field manuals and a marked-up syllabus draft. She wore the same boots, same quiet step, but something had shifted. When she passed Sergeant Haney near the tech station, he nodded without hesitation. She nodded back. Inside, Captain Ward was reviewing schedules. She didn't knock. Just placed the updated course plan on his desk and said she'd begin Module 1 next Monday, weather permitting. He raised an eyebrow, then smiled faint. No one clapped. No one called her hero. But the door didn't close behind her this time. She stayed, not as a shadow, not as a memory, but as Nora Quinn, present, full, and finally, choosing how to live forward not around the past, but through it.